was the original shredder, a guitarist and a founding member of LA's legendary Wrecking Crew. His talent brought him from the most humble of beginnings to the very heights of stardom and fortune, but it came with a price. So join us as we examine the life, times, and unique locations of an American music icon, Glen Travis Campbell.
Hey everybody, this is Tim and welcome to the show. You know, according to his bio, Glen Campbell was born in Delight, Arkansas, but it says that only because the town he was actually born in, called Billstown, was too small to put on the map. And he started playing guitar at a very young age, and without any formal training was doing shows and touring as a duo with his uncle at 15. And a few years later found himself gigging and playing shows in Albuquerque and at a Saturday afternoon children's show. His life changed when he was first introduced to the music of Django Reinhardt. Reinhardt is a guitarist, and Glen became a virtual student of his playing, and it elevated his chops above those of his peers. You know, Glen's aha moment came in 1959 on his first trip to Las Vegas. He happened to catch singer Bobby Darin's band, and he knew without a doubt he was better than the guitar player. And it was at that moment that he decided to make his move and come to Hollywood. So I thought we'd start with a drive-by of some of the legendary studios that Glen frequented with the Wrecking Crew here in Hollywood. They all seem to be within like a square mile of one another right off Sunset Boulevard here. And here's Sunset Sound right here, as a matter of fact. So Glen arrived here in LA in 1960 with his new wife, Billie Jean, and after a few weeks of near starvation, got a gig touring with a group called the Champs, who had a hit with a song called Tequila. And as a matter of fact, two of the other members of the Champs would later go on to become Seals and Crofts. But anyways, that led to a gig as a staff writer with American Publishing, but it didn't take long before Glen felt he was being cheated, and he moved on to studio playing, which brings us here. This is Columbia Studios, where Glen did a lot of work, including things like Sounds of Silence with Simon and Garfunkel. Right here. So another couple blocks up the road right here would be United Recording, and this is where Glen did some sessions with a good friend of his, Ricky Nelson. Everything was pretty close-knit. Scale in those days was $65 for a 3-hour session, plus back-end reuse residuals, and Glen estimates that in 1963 alone, he played on 580-some recordings. So just up the street here, a few hundred feet, is the former Western Recorders, and this is where Glen had done multiple sessions for the Beach Boys, and they were so impressed that in 1964 he went on the road as their replacement for Brian Wilson and was actually invited to join permanently, which he declined. He still had his eyes on a solo career. So Glen's first go-around with Elvis Presley happened right here at Radio Recorders during the recording of Viva Las Vegas. What was interesting about this gig was that Glen and Elvis had met way back in Glen's club days in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and Elvis, who had somewhat of a photographic memory, actually remembered meeting him. It was on a night he was famously overpowered by screaming fans, and as Elvis told him, "How could I forget it? I almost died on that night." Right here, Radio Recorders. So here in this completely average strip mall is what used to be Gold Star Studios, where some of the most legendary music of the 50s and 60s was recorded, and where I would imagine Glen worked with the Wrecking Crew on an almost daily basis. So this was Phil Spector's go-to studio. He did the Ronettes here, the Righteous Brothers, Ike and Tina Turner. What set Glen Campbell apart from the other studio musicians was that he couldn't read music. He could read a chord chart, but he couldn't read the actual score or melody the arranger had written. Nevertheless, he was always able to come up with something fast on the first or second take, and I think that's a testament to what a great musician Glen Campbell was. By the end of '64, Glen was making six figures. He had started a family and bought a house in the Hollywood Hills. He tried to act cool and unimpressed, but he was often starstruck by the talent like Frank Sinatra. His first Sinatra session was for the song Strangers in the Night, and it was a song that he and the Wrecking Crew would get the master of on take one, which brings us here to where they cut it at the legendary Capitol Studios. Glen had signed a record deal here with Capitol Records as a country artist with fairly disappointing results. But in 1967, on his fifth album, he insisted on taking creative control and picking his own songs. On his way to the studio here one day, he heard an artist named John Hartford doing a song called Gentle on My Mind, and he was totally knocked out. Glen recorded a demo at Capitol with the Wrecking Crew, and his producer submitted it to the brass upstairs, and they released it as a single a week later. Glen had never intended his singing to be anything other than a demo on it, and as a matter of fact, they erased his instructions to the Wrecking Crew as the song went along, telling them when to get in and out. And I think that kind of gives it a casualness that perhaps really struck a nerve with the song. Gentle on My Mind didn't set the world on fire, but it did make it onto the Hot 100 pop charts and was integral to crossing over into the pop world. Glen was well on his way to becoming a worldwide star, but it wouldn't come without a steep price. In 1967, while he was about to start working on his follow-up to Gentle on My Mind, Glen found himself here in the confines of Western Studio 3, the very same room made famous by the Beach Boys where Glen had recorded with them on Good Vibrations. There were some album covers laying around, and he saw one by Johnny Rivers that had a song written by a young writer named Jimmy Webb called By the Time I Get to Phoenix. The title piqued Glen's interest, and he eventually decided to record it, and it became the hit that would completely change his life. A few months later, Glen rang up Jimmy Webb and asked him if he could write something new, another song with a town in the title along the lines of Phoenix, and he told him he needed it like yesterday. Jimmy said he'd try and proceeded to come up with an idea at his piano about something he had seen in his Oklahoman youth about a lonesome blue-collar lineman way up on a telephone pole in the middle of nowhere, talking on a field phone that he imagined was to his girl. During the couple hours Jimmy was working on it, Glen called him time and time again, wanting to know how it was progressing. Jimmy told him he was having trouble with the third verse, but that he'd make him a cassette and send over what he had unfinished. So a couple days went by, and Jimmy ran into Glen at a session and asked how it was going. Glen told him great and handed him an acetate of the rough tracks and vocal for the song. To Jimmy's surprise, Glen and producer Al DeLore had foregone the lyrics on the third verse and put a Dan Electro 6-string baritone guitar playing the melody over it instead. There was also an element on Jimmy Webb's original demo that Glen loved, and it was that dee-dee-dee-dee-dee satellite sound that came from his massively heavy Gobranson church organ. In those days, there was no such thing as sampling, so they had to go to his house, load it on a truck, and bring it to the studio. And I actually think it turned out to be the track's signature sound. But I think the biggest compliment ever bestowed upon this song was by none other than Bob Dylan when he proclaimed it the greatest song ever written. When asked by Tommy Smothers if he could read cue cards, Glen answered, "I can if the words ain't too big," and thus began Glen's first guest shot on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, which was filmed here at CBS Television City, right next door to the famous LA Farmers Market. So the Television City studios are temporarily closed for renovations, but here at Farmers Market is where many of the shows, like All in the Family, the Carol Burnett Show, and of course the Glen Campbell Show, would come and eat lunch at. So those guest shots on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour turned into Glen hosting 6 episodes of a summer replacement called the Summer Brothers Smothers Hour. I hope I got that right. Writers like Steve Martin, Rob Reiner, and McLean Stevenson would often come up with controversial material that Glen would sometimes balk at doing. And to say the least, Glen was a little to the right of the Smothers Brothers, which was just fine with the executives at CBS because they were constantly having trouble with the censors, with Tommy and Dick's views on Vietnam and Richard Nixon. So in January of 1969, just a couple weeks before one of Glen's biggest hits was launched, which was Galveston, the network decided that he was ready for his own show, and they launched it. The show became an immediate hit, and it showcased Glen's immense musical talents and that of his guests. And yeah, it could get a mite corny sometimes, but it really showcased to America bands like Cream, Linda Ronstadt, the Monkees. But between the rigors of recording, touring, and the show, Glen was known to say, "I don't have a career, my career has me."
Besides music, Glen's other love in life was golf, and he was a scratch golfer that played whenever he wasn't on the road, and oftentimes even when he was. But from 1971 to 1983, Glen hosted the prestigious LA Open golf tournament at Riviera, which was actually rechristened the Glen Campbell Los Angeles Open. But by 1974, Glen's career was in decline, and although he'd been constantly touring and recording, he hadn't had a hit in 5 years. But one day while he was driving and listening to the radio, he heard a song by Larry Weiss that stopped him in his tracks. The lyric absolutely resonated with him, and it was called Rhinestone Cowboy. It's a song about a musician struggling to make it, and it ended up being the biggest hit of his career. And as a matter of fact, when it came out in 1975, it topped the country and the pop charts, which I've heard is not an easy thing to do. But by this point, Glen Campbell was hardly the clean-cut American country boy he portrayed on records and TV shows. Alcohol and cocaine had begun to completely take over control of his life. Glen and his wife, Billie Jean, and their 3 kids had been living in this spectacular, now abandoned, Laurel Canyon 7-acre estate. But after 16 years, they had completely drifted apart, and the end finally came when Glen drove home from the studio one day with his new song, Rhinestone Cowboy, and played it for Billie, and she said something along the lines, it was a stupid old cowboy song. An argument ensued, and she finally blurted out, "I want a separation." The shame and loneliness of a second failed marriage drove Glen even deeper into alcohol and cocaine abuse, but it didn't take long before he hooked up with Sarah Davis, who at the time was still married to good friend Mac Davis, and anyway, they eventually got married and had a son, but after 4 tumultuous years, they split up, and Glen found himself doing copious amounts of cocaine, not to mention watching marathon sessions of infamous TV evangelist Gene Scott, and blowing kilt is not a good combination. By this time, he wasn't drinking and drugging to enjoy life. He was doing it to escape it. And before that divorce was final, he took up with a 21-year-old singer who claimed that she could out-party anyone in Hollywood, and that, of course, was Tanya Tucker. At the time, Glen was 44 and determined to keep up with her, and during the explosive 15 months they dated, he got more press than he had gotten for his entire career, and most of it was not flattering. Glen was once quoted as saying, "I think only somebody dumb enough to use cocaine actually uses cocaine." In one particularly booze-fueled brawl, she claims he knocked out her front teeth, which of course Glen denied, but there was no denying that their relationship was totally toxic. They were like fire and gasoline. They fought and partied and fought some more, and this went on for 15 months. Which brings us to wife number 4, the former Kimberly Woolen, who Glen met on a blind date in 1981 and was with him until his death in 2017. Kim was a devout Christian and helped rekindle Glen's lifelong faith, but he didn't go down quietly. He finally quit drugs and alcohol in 1993 and had a rather infamous relapse in 2003 where he spent 10 days in jail for drunk driving. Eventually they owned homes in Phoenix, Malibu, and Nashville, Tennessee. But anyways, the 7-acre Glen Campbell Laurel Canyon estate. One of Glen and his family's most important contributions was his advocacy of those with Alzheimer's.
And although he wasn't officially diagnosed until 2011, it is suspected that he was suffering from some of the effects for years. And many people wonder if the reason he was able to stave off the very worst for so long was his ability to play music. And there are clips of Glen at the end where he's almost unable to speak, but he can still play some pretty impossible runs on the guitar. So in 2014, director James Sikich filmed I'll Be Me, the documentary of Glen's farewell tour, warts and all. It's sometimes hard to watch, but in my opinion stands as the best all-time documentary about Alzheimer's. Anyways, I'd like to thank Glen Campbell for all the great music and the terrific story. And it's at this point in the show where I shamelessly request your subscription and to like the channel. And if you like classic rock, we've got a great library. I think you'll dig it. But anyways, for Tim, thanks for coming. Peace out.
I like that.
Oh, excuse me. Pardon me.
Oh, pardon me. Oh, I'm sorry. Pardon me.